If you were reading the newspaper and you saw the word massacre being used by the journalist, what does the word massacre mean? Well, it depends on which section of the paper you're reading. If you're on the front page, it probably means a lot of people were killed. If you're in the sports page, somebody got trounced. It was a massacre. Or if you're reading the financial page, you go, oh, investors lost a lot of money today. Now, why is it that you interpret a word, massacre, three different ways based on which section of the newspaper you're reading? Because we know that different genres have different intentions. And we know that it brings context to our words so that we can understand our word. And the same thing is true with the Bible. If we want to understand our verse, if we want to understand our word, we need to know what genre of the Bible that we are in. Let's read the paper again. A genre is a category of literature. Let's say the word loaded is being used in the newspaper. What does loaded mean? Well, if you're on the front page, Larry Johnson got loaded and drove like a madman. Real estate section, that home is loaded. Sports, he loaded his rifle and shot a bullseye. Local news, the pavilion was loaded with people. We automatically interpret a Bible verse intuitively based on genre, a category of literature. And this will help you to read your Bible right. Lawyers do this. It's a habeas corpus or a habeas, I think, delicti, different forms of legal writings. And they know that they need to read them differently. And we need to know that too about our Bibles. We read poetry different than we read a newspaper. You read fiction differently than nonfiction. And the same thing is true with the Bible. It's got laws, poetry, proverbs, letters, prophecy, apocalyptic literature, gospels, and historical narrative. Genre and context are going to help you understand the meaning of your verse and even the meaning of words. And so that's why it's probably best to not say, I read the Bible literally, because we shouldn't read everything literally. What should we say? I read the Bible based on the genre of literature being employed. That's how we read the Bible. And that's why whenever you run into somebody who's an antagonist, they're trying to fight against you, they take verses out of different genres because they are not using the genre to guide the interpretation, to throw it at you. We don't want to make the same mistake. So let's study biblical genres, starting with Old Testament narrative. These are true story books: Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. That type of literature is also called historical narrative, an historical telling, the accurate telling of the history, specifically of the Jewish nation in the Old Testament, out of which the promised seed would come. Now, it's going to be a little bit tricky because there's definitely theology in these books, but they're not written didactically. You're just told the story. And sometimes we see good behavior and bad behavior. How do we know which one is right? Well, we need to find clear teachings from other parts of the Bible to tell us what those things are. So this can be a little bit tricky, and we're going to learn how to make our way through those choppy waters. But understanding that historical narrative is just a telling. There's some theology, but it's got to be gleaned out of the narrative. And we're going to learn how to do that. Next, our Old Testament law. There is law buried in historical narrative that we see. Now, the word law can mean the entire Old Testament. It can mean the Pentateuch, which is Genesis through Deuteronomy, first 5 books. It can mean the 10 Commandments. It can mean Exodus 20 through Deuteronomy 33, which is the Mosaic law. Context has to help us know what the author was talking about. You're going to read Romans, this comparison between law and grace. What law is he referring to? Well, my context is going to help me to know what law he is talking about. Now, how do we know which laws from the Old Testament apply? How come we do wear blended fabrics? How come we don't have fences around our rooftop? Why do we eat pork? Well, it's because we understand this genre. So there are 3 ways to determine which laws, if any, apply to us. And here's the three ways. The first is that the law is separated into three categories: moral, civil, and ceremonial. We say the moral applies, but there's a problem with this. The Old Testament just doesn't make that distinction. Now, you can hold on to any one of these three. I'm not sure any of them are totally perfect, but just be mindful that when the author of Hebrews is saying that the Old Covenant is gone, he doesn't say just the ceremonial part. He's saying 8 through 10, this thing is gone. This thing is gone, because he doesn't seem to make those distinctions. It can be helpful. I'm not persuaded that's the best way to understand Old Testament law. Number two, all of the Old Testament laws are in place unless the New Testament repeals it. Now, that's a little bit tricky when it comes to farming and clothing, because those rules are not repealed in the New Testament. You know, all the rules about how you're supposed to farm, taking time off, 7 years, 50 years, giving the land a break, those things are not ever repealed in the New Testament. Third option, and this happens to be the one I hold to loosely, but nevertheless, none of the Old Testament laws apply unless the New Testament reiterates. That's how I think we deal with these laws. They're gone. We aren't under that law. We're not under the law anymore. We are under grace. Now, you feel a little queasy about that. Wait a second, what do I do with all of those things? Well, you rightly understand what they were written, where they were written for, and you really take it law by law, not section by section, to figure out the principle that carries forward to our day. So, thou shalt not murder. We're not under the Mosaic law, which contains the 10 commandments. But does that mean we get to murder? No. Why not? Well, it's reiterated elsewhere in the Bible, whether it's with the covenant people or not. Second of all, we know that that's a principle that God has for all time. So we're not done. We're not unhitching from the Old Testament at all. There is much to be learned about Jesus Christ. There is much to be learned about the character and the nature of God. We see this progressive unfolding revelation. We just need to make sure that we are handling these laws rightly. Those are three ways to handle the law, and it's debatable which is best. Figure out your own, and I wouldn't call you a heretic.